Okay, so today I'm here with Sam Watson. We were connected by a mutual friend called Richard Selwyn Barnett, who is like the king of connections and just keeps putting incredible people in front of me. And what I really liked about what you were doing, Sam, you're doing podcasts and advice and just putting stuff out there for Gen Z. And what's incredible about it is you're only 18. So I remember having our conversation and thinking, if I had half the entrepreneurial get up and go at your age, then I can only imagine where I'd be. I'd probably be buying Necker Island off Richard Branson at this stage. So first and foremost, thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely no worries. It's a pleasure to be here.
And for people that don't know you, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So when I was 17, I was applying to universities in the UK. I was applying for a French and business course, and I realized I needed some work experience. So I contacted this company called Wing that I saw on TikTok, and I messaged the CEO and I said, look, can I get some work experience? I was there for a couple of weeks, and then they decided to give me equity in the company to keep me on board. And then I've been working there ever since as business development manager. I realized that a few of my friends were kind of making fun of what I was doing. So I started a podcast as a way for young people to get inspired by other entrepreneurs and industry professionals to become business people at a young age, like I became, sorry. And then I always had the intention of turning it into a brand. So I recently launched Enterprising Gen Z Events. So my podcast is called the Enterprising Gen Z Podcast. And then I created the events company as an extension of the podcast, to bring the value of the podcast into real life and inspire other entrepreneurs, and also to kind of experience entrepreneurship myself. But so far I've learned so much, and it's really great to share what I've been learning with my audience, and hopefully inspire some other young entrepreneurs too.
It's fantastic. And obviously at your age, a lot of people that would be thinking about, oh, shall I go to university or not? And yet here you are, like really quite well established in the world of business. And so what would you attribute that to? I mean, what makes you go down this different route?
I think I have to give it to my grandparents. Actually, I remember I used to stay with them every Monday and Tuesday, and we'd always watch Dragon's Den. My grandparents gave me Duncan Bannatyne's autobiography when I was younger. I started my first business called the Shiny Stuff Club when I was 4 years old. I would find shiny things and then sell them on. But I've always really been interested in business. It kind of faded slightly when I grew up. I wanted to get involved in the world of sports psychology. I was very interested about success in rugby. But then getting exposed to entrepreneurship and the business world through my work at Wing really relit this passion, and I think that's why I am where I am today. It's just through the experience of working within a small scale startup that really made me want to become an entrepreneur myself.
Fantastic. And I mean, I guess now the world is your oyster. So tell us, since you started, how has that startup evolved?
So essentially, I started it off. It's actually been really interesting. I think my main takeaway so far is kind of the learning experience that I've had. Enterprising Gen Z Events, I launched it. I had a B2C model. So essentially putting on events and selling tickets essentially was the business model. I quickly learned that a B2B model would probably be better. So essentially using the events as a marketing tool for businesses to get in front of their ideal client. So that kind of involves giving tickets away for free. The people going to the events don't aren't consumers anymore. It's more a marketing tool for businesses. So I think that the learning that I've gone through is probably my biggest takeaway. Also, I'm currently at a business school in Paris called YesEgg School of Management. It's really interesting to kind of link the theory to the practical knowledge that I've got so far, which is really, really interesting. And also the connections, people that I've met. I've had some really, really fantastic conversation with people. I think that's something else that I love about the startup ecosystem is everyone's willing to have a chat, everyone's willing to talk, and everyone's willing to help each other. And actually just the exposure to some really, really fantastic people in especially the London and Paris startup ecosystem.
Wow. So, I mean, you've ended up in Paris. How did that happen?
Well, my mother is French. And in the UK, business schools aren't really a thing, but they're very, very popular in France. And ever since I started the podcast and my role with Wing, I realized I wanted a career in business, and I wanted to link the practical knowledge I have to the theoretical knowledge of business. I always loved Paris as a city. I remember coming here when I was small, and I fell in love with the city. So here I am now. I got accepted into the business school with a scholarship, which is fantastic. And yeah, I'm loving it so far.
Brilliant. And what advice would you give to your generation, people of your age that were thinking about it, maybe wanting to probably run riot or go on a year gap year or anything like that? I mean, what would you say to anybody that didn't know what they wanted to do at your age?
I would say, I know this sounds very, very cliche, but really follow your passion. So I don't think I would have survived, or not survived, but I wouldn't have thrived in a traditional university. Hence why I chose a business school. I think if you're not following your passion, you're not going to do things at 100%, which is also why, I started the business, because I had a passion for events. I also had experience in events management with a previous company that I worked for called Gen Z Talks. They kind of want to bridge the gap between education and the workplace, and their values that I really agree with. Again, I had a passion for them, so that's why I worked with them for a long period of time. I think passion plus knowledge is kind of the key to success in any field, and the way you get knowledge is through experience. So if you're not quite sure about what you want to do, I would really encourage just to try out a few different things. Try out a few different professions, and see what you like and go from there.
Fantastic. So just bring it alive for us. Obviously you're a very young age still now, and you're just relatively at the beginning of your journey, but I mean, already I know that your podcast is growing quite well. Can you just bring that alive to us? I mean, how big is your audience? Where are you? Well, I mean, how many different countries are they in? And when did you begin it? And how long has it taken you to get there?
So I think I started the podcast about 8 months ago, but it hasn't been consistent because I had my A-levels bang in the middle of season 1 and season 2. So I took a few months just to kind of focus on my exams, which I'm very glad I did. So I don't think I would have achieved the grades I did if I focused on the podcast. So in terms of analytics, the problem with podcast analytics is that it aggregates loads and loads of listeners from different platforms, so it's very difficult to get into one number. But I do have numbers on countries, so I think it's about in 36 countries at the moment I'm listening to. I recently charted in the UK and Hong Kong, which was nice. And yeah, it's growing really quickly. Actually, I had to check the map every couple of days because it's growing at a rate that I wouldn't have expected at the start. So every day when I log on to my analytics platform, I see a couple more countries pop up. And it's interesting because there's countries that I would have never expected to be on there, like Senegal and Kenya and South Korea, not English speaking countries, and potentially countries where you wouldn't expect entrepreneurship and Gen Z entrepreneurship especially to be so popular. But actually some of those countries are some of my biggest listening bases, which is really interesting.
That's incredible. I mean, it really is. That stat alone, to have achieved that at any stage in your business life would be an achievement, let alone to have done it before your 19th birthday. I mean, that's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive. So kudos there. And what would you put it down to? What's the X factor here that people don't talk about? What's the missing link for people that go out and do what you've done and the people that will never do it?
I think consistency is massive. So I make sure that I'm posting every week. I think you'll never see results if you're not consistent. I'm consistent. Another example of this would be my LinkedIn. All of my friends who are on LinkedIn have like 3 connections. I think I'm about 1.7 thousand connections now. I'm always looking for people who I'm interested in their content and consistently requesting every single week. people aren't going to want to interact with a podcast if it's not consistent. I think that's the same with social media. If you want to create a social media following, consistency in posting is really, really important. I think the second thing is my age. There's probably not many people hitting the same niche as me because of my age. And I think that's definitely another factor. I also think sometimes, I don't know if I'm expressing it well over this Zoom call, but I think I have quite a bubbly personality, and I kind of say what I think. I'm quite honest. And I think, again, potentially my personality, where other entrepreneurs can be, a bit stone cold, I think I come across quite well. And I think, again, for an 18-year-old, I think potentially confidence is another thing. And also I think it's very difficult for people to start sometimes. So young people, I don't think this potentially is a trait among Gen Z. We may have an idea, but we may not act upon it. I think if I have an idea, I always make sure that I act upon it, because you never know if it's going to be the next big thing. There were a few iterations of the podcast that I went through before I got to where I am today. So the first iteration was, the idea was called Teenage Biz Buzz, which I'm so glad I didn't go with that name because it's terrible. But I think, consistency, having a personality and engaging with your audience. I make sure that I'm consistently talking with like Instagram DMs, replying to comments, interacting with my following, really encouraging a audience base of the audience being able to have communication with me. So for example, I always put my LinkedIn in the bio of my podcasts, because I really encourage the audiences to let me know. And actually it's how I found some of the guests for my podcast, because they've sent me a message saying, I've launched my business, can I get some PR around it? Of course, of course you can. So I think creating an audience, I'm forging an audience of entrepreneurs and people who actually care about your content and see you as a person rather than a corporation or a brand, I think is important.
Fantastic. I have some really solid advice there. And what do you see for the future for yourself? Where do you see yourself in, say, 20 years?
It's interesting you asked that question, because I got asked that literally yesterday. 20 years is a long way away. I think I'll be what, 28? I think my maths is right. But I would really hope that by the time I'm 28, my business is consistently making enough money for me to go independent and not have to work a traditional job. I'd also quite like the podcast be a bit bigger than where it is today. On the same level as Stephen Bartlett and lots of the other podcasts that I listen to. I'd also quite like to become more of a public speaker. So I do a bit of public speaking and interviews such as this one. But I would quite like to kind of up the ante there. And also, I think Enterprising Gen Z as a brand, I'd quite like to expand it. So a couple of ideas I've had. So at the moment, I've got Enterprising Gen Z podcast, Enterprising Gen Z events. I think the third place I'd like to move into is Enterprising Gen Z publications. So potentially a publishing house for Gen Z business books, for example, or books that will inspire Gen Z and kind of keep with the values that I've created with my other two EGZ kind of subsidiary companies. I think that's where I'd like to move into. I think Enterprising Gen Z as a brand, I'd quite like it to grow and have kind of lots of projects under the Enterprising Gen Z name. I think that's where potentially I'll move into. It's all about trialing and testing. There's a really interesting concept that I read recently called Ooching. So it's where you test lots of little things and see what works and see what doesn't. I'd quite like to test a few things like publications, the event side of things, to see what works, what doesn't, what gains traction. But I think a lot of trial and error is in the future for me.
Oh, I'd say so. But I'd say by judging by your results so far that that will only lead you to good places, Sam. I mean, certainly the world of being in business it's not all sweetness and light. But I mean, as long as you say, the consistency is there, then you're definitely heading in the right direction. So is there anything else you would like to share that you think is really important?
One last thing that I'd quite like to share is the importance of help and advice in the world of entrepreneurship. There's one thing I've learned being in and around the London startup ecosystem is that people are always willing to offer help. Now, when I started my work with Wing, and I still work for that company, the CEO, Sina Sadzadeh, who's super talented, always, would have calls with me and feedback and explain what I was doing wrong and what I could improve on to really kind of help me out. I think people will always be, when you're young, be willing to offer help. Now, I've sent messages to people on LinkedIn asking, especially with events, because finding sponsorship with events wasn't something that I'd had experience with. And I asked for some help, and we jumped on a call, and they were really helpful in the advice that they gave me. I think that the openness and the willingness to accept help from others is really important. I think part of the problem with kind of the male condition, let's call it, is sometimes we take our pride too seriously, and sometimes we are not willing to ask for help when we should be able to. One thing I've learned is you really shouldn't think like this, and you should really be willing to ask for help, because sometimes the advice that you're given and the information that you're offered is so valuable, and the tailored advice is way better than advice you get listening to my podcast or from this interview, because it's tailored to you. So asking for help, I would reiterate, is really valuable.
That's brilliant advice, Sam. And I wish I'd learned that at your age. It would have saved me a lot of pain on my journey. I can tell you that for nothing. So that's critical. And there really is. There's certainly a lot of people out there that are prepared to help. And it's absolutely solid advice. So for anyone that wants to find out a little bit more about you or get hold of your podcast, where do they go?
Sure. So please send me a message on LinkedIn. It's Sam Watson. In my profile picture, I've got this ridiculous moustache and beard that I need to change the picture, but that'll be me. Also, you can have a look at my website. It's www.egzpod.com. My events website is egzevents.com. And my podcast, Enterprising Gen Z, is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any podcast directory you can think of, I'm on there.
That's brilliant. Sam, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.
A pleasure.